It is my pleasure and my honor on behalf of my community, the Muslim community, to introduce and to welcome Mr. John Taylor Gatto. Mr. John Taylor Gatto was a public school educator for 30 years in the city of New York. He taught in the elite public schools, and he taught in the schools that no one else would teach at. He taught. He was in many different grades and levels, served on various committees. Mr. Gatto's work in the public schools of New York was so recognized by his peers and by the administration under which he worked that he was named New York City Teacher of the Year several times. And then, in the last hurrah, was named New York State Teacher of the Year. Mr. Gatto is indeed one of the most celebrated educators in North America. But in quite a strange turn, and perhaps not so strange after you hear him, Mr. Gatto left public education over a decade ago to pursue a thorough investigation of the purpose and the history of schooling. And Mr. Gatto, for us, for many young educators like myself, represents a fresh voice. I can remember the first time when I opened his seminal work, The 7-Lesson School Teacher, and having an interest in education and being at a faculty of education, I read it. And by the end of it, I was like struck by a lightning bolt. There was such truth and honesty in what he had to say, and it has been our dream for many years to have him on the stage here in Toronto, speaking to the Muslim community and to the community at large. Mr. Gatto tonight is going to be addressing an important topic. He's going to be talking about communities where learning doesn't really matter. To set up the stage for our next speaker, Shaykh Hamza Yusuf. Without any further ado, it is my honor and my pleasure to introduce to you Mr. John Taylor Gatto.
I must tell you that the sweetest sound to a 70-year-old man who's about 80 pounds overweight is to hear himself described as a fresh voice. I have two brief apologies to make to you before I begin. About a week ago, I backed into a tree and knocked my lower teeth loose, so if you have some difficulty with my accent placing it, it's bad driving. That's the accent. And the second apology is that I'm going to work from a script, and I do that for your own protection, because if I begin to ad-lib, who knows, we'll have to lock the doors, you'll never get out of here. I'm reading from the latest work that I've been doing, researching the history and background of forced schooling or compulsory schooling, which is really an identity between Canada and the United States. They're quite similar, even though there are local differences, and the architects of Canadian schooling, the architects of U.S. schooling, were in fact closely allied with one another. The man from whom I first got wind of the real purpose of American schooling was James Bryant Conant, a Mayflower descendant and one of the influential Americans of the 20th century. I'll get to what those purposes are in a little while, but first we have to do some groundwork together, beginning with the matter of boredom. When I was a boy, my granddad told me that bored people are childish people, so not to ever say aloud that I was bored. He said that the obligation to enlighten myself and amuse myself could never be passed off as anybody else's responsibility but my own. And in the area where I grew up, in western Pennsylvania, around Pittsburgh, I can honestly say, no matter how radical it sounds, that not once did I ever hear a companion or an enemy utter the expression, "I'm bored." I didn't hear that said, although I knew the dictionary definition, till I got to New York City, where everybody said, "I'm bored," all the time, every day. I couldn't escape the expression. On that basis, that we're responsible for our own amusement and enlightenment. American secondary schools, North American secondary schools, can fairly be called childish places because they are places of exquisite boredom. Think of school as we have evolved it in the past 100 years as a laboratory of extended childishness. Then think of the possibility that this might have been done for some rational purpose. As significant as the boredom of young people in schools is, the fact is that teachers in these institutions are bored too. They might not so readily admit it, but boredom is the common condition of school teachers, their low energy, their dispirited speech, and often their whining is the giveaway. If you ask school kids, as I often did, why they feel bored, they always give the same few answers. They say that the work is stupid, that it makes no sense, or that they already know it. They say they want to be doing something real, not just sitting around. The teachers themselves don't seem to know much, and in any case, clearly aren't interested in what they teach. And when you ask teachers why they are bored, they say it's the kids' fault. They say that kids are rude, that they aren't interested in anything except grades, so how can a teacher be interested in them? It's a catch-22, you see. When you look at schools closely, you gradually become aware what childish places they are. How many kids and even teachers are held prisoners there in a childhood they would willingly have left long ago if they knew how, and if the institution had enabled them to escape. Before I continue, let me define my subject here a bit further. Think of a continuum from childlike, that's what we expect young children to be, innocent, trusting, respectful, obedient, anxious to please, and then go all the way across to childish. The palette of childish characteristics includes selfishness, irresponsibility, boredom, envy, inconsiderate behavior, whining, and in general a lack of emotional proportion and self-discipline. Childish people need to be attended by adults. That's important, so don't forget it because it'll come in handy in a few minutes. It's an important clue to what's really going on. Now contrast that childlike to childish continuum with another familiar word, youthful, which offers quite a positive window on human character. Youthful means adventurous, energetic, curious, resilient, indomitable, surprising, open to new experience. Very few schools I've ever seen could possibly contain, let alone encourage, youthfulness. I hope you recognize the paradox in that, an institutional structure which finds itself compelled to suppress those very qualities which are universally acknowledged to be passports of success in Western society. Obviously, we're in the presence of some greater interest or interests which need protection against full self-development on the part of too many. To explain rationally why we have the schools we do. Put simply, they can't be the way they are unless it serves some purpose or purposes. They are not expensive accidents. Remember, rationality and reasonableness are two different things. Surely it isn't hard to make the case that our schools are unreasonable by discouraging the ingredients of youthfulness, but that's a far cry from saying they're irrational. You'll see what I mean a little more clearly as we proceed. How many of you knew that secondary school was hardly the only path to maturity until World War II? Junior high school didn't even exist until well into the 20th century, and high school was only a minor part of society until the second quarter of the same century. Now, maybe you think that's progress, but how do you factor this little detail in? Did you know that even today in wealthy Switzerland, less than 1 kid in 4 goes beyond elementary school? Shall I repeat that? In the richest nation in the world per capita, less than 1 kid in 4 goes beyond elementary school. You wouldn't be likely to know that because North America's responsible newspapers, magazines, and media outlets and education schools don't bother to tell you that. And that's a big paradox, wouldn't you agree? For most of our history, kids did not go to secondary school. At least most kids didn't. Yet the unschooled rose to be admirals like Farragut, inventors like Edison, captains of industry like Carnegie and Rockefeller, presidents like Washington and Lincoln, writers like Melville, or scholars like Margaret Mead, who never saw the inside of a schoolroom. People who reached age 13 were not looked upon as children. Ariel Durant, who co-wrote the well-known History of the World, sold by Book of the Month Club, which I guess some of you own because they use it as a premium, was married at 13 to the man she stayed married to for more than 50 years. Would she really have been better off doing junior high school homework than starting her life? Was her husband, Will Durant, some form of sexual pervert? Or is there something left out of the story that we've been sold about the proper role of 13-year-olds? If we had a successful system of education before we had universal forced schooling, as the examples of Lincoln, Carnegie, and Margaret Mead suggest, why were these training grounds in boredom that we call forced schooling demanded as a replacement for it? It's a puzzle. But as we track childlike, childish, and boring schools to their origins, we find ourselves back in time about 2 centuries in the northern European nation of Prussia. By 1820, Prussia was teaching the world that schools could be training grounds for obedient political subjects. I'll just step away from the script for a minute to say that the 3 traditional purposes of schooling, wherever it's appeared around the world, still seem reasonable to most people if you present them with the case. The first purpose we could call the religious purpose, to make good people, but in fact there are systems to approach that in the secular world as well. The second purpose is to make good citizens, people that will shoulder the burden of the community, act as leaders, take on responsibility for other people. And the third purpose is that your individual God-given gifts can be developed, can be enhanced in this protected environment. Purpose 1, Purpose 2, Purpose 3. Nothing about creating obedient political subjects, which is the fourth purpose of schooling, and that's the subject of the film I'm trying to make about the history of schooling. It's called The Fourth Purpose, and if any of you have a yen to get on my website, it's just my name with .com at the end of it, and you can read about that film. Anyway, Prussia was teaching the world that schools could be training grounds to be obedient political subjects, and that the mechanism to perform this magic was, not surprisingly, habit training, sensitizing children to be reflexively responsible to propaganda. How well this scheme worked to concentrate state power in that little poor nation up against the North Sea, the world was soon to learn in 3 titanic Prussian wars between 1871 and 1945. I say Prussian wars because Prussia eventually swallowed all of Germany. Beyond its war-enhancing ability, Prussian habit control schools served the emerging mass-production business empires just coming into being as dominant factors in national economies. German psychology early saw that the school could condition children to be susceptible to any sort of authoritarian appeals, including the soft-core authoritarianisms of advertising and public relations. If that were true, then Adam Smith's implacable laws of supply and demand could be repudiated. For if demand could be created for anything or any idea, a managerial revolution was at hand, one which freed managers, including politicians who are, after all, social managers, freed them from a slavish inquiry and dependence upon public opinion. Public opinion could be what management made it. And for any of you here who are students of business, of marketing, you know that marketing really means overcoming sales resistance. This can be done by saying, hey, you've got a flat tire and I'll sell you a good tire to replace it, but can also be done by saying that set of apparently good tires you have in your car is horrible and it's socially degrading, and you can buy these tires that have a white stripe around the wheel and upgrade your social status. Now, if you think that's an absurd story about tires, I want you to think about sneakers for children that cost $150, even though they're made of exactly the same materials in the same factories as the sneakers that are made for $10 for children. And the only difference is the Air Jordan logo on the side and maybe a slight difference in styling. So this is a major idea I'm presenting to you, and it was a major idea when it occurred to businessmen, big businessmen, not merchants, big businessmen, that they didn't have to wait for a demand, that they could take whatever supply was easily at hand or cheapest at hand and peddle it by psychological means. Thus, from the very beginning, the founders of compulsory schooling aimed at collectivizing and socializing the ordinary population through the inculcation of habits of dependency. In simpler terms, they worked to extend childhood beyond its natural limits by arranging the removal of young people from home and neighborhood surroundings and their placement with total strangers, false kin, as it were, unknown to parents. And to deepen the bewildering estrangement, these strangers were themselves under the comprehensive direction of faraway strangers, completely hidden from public view, from whose decisions there was no appeal. I hope that the Latinate phrasing doesn't conceal from you that I'm talking about the fact that your local principal takes his orders, he thinks, from the local superintendent, but the local superintendent full well knows that he's taking his orders from somewhere else. He's not quite sure where. It might be the Carnegie Foundation, it might be from the government or from its agency assigned to schooling. And if you go into the government and the agencies assigned to schooling, you find out that they're taking their orders from somewhere else, and they're not quite sure where, but they do know that key politicians will punish them if these orders aren't followed. And so we get into the rarefied realm of political control, but that we'll save for another talk. So as I told you at the start, I first got wind of the real purposes of American schooling from James Bryant Conant, president of Harvard University for 30 years, an inner circle manager of the atomic bomb project during World War II, high commissioner of the American zone in occupied Germany after the war. And shortly after the war, this Mr. Conant began to produce a stream of books about schools and society. I would have no doubt that in the university library, all of those books, and there are a great many, are available. Conant is often credited with being the principal legitimatizer of gargantuan high school plants, those anonymous warehouses of 2,000 to 5,000 students like Columbine in Littleton, Colorado. In a book published in 1949 bearing the title The Child, the Parent, and the State, I mean, there's a title to roll around inside your mouth. The Child, the Parent, and the State. Conant mentioned in passing that a coup had given us modern schooling. He didn't bother to elaborate on the details of that coup. He simply stated that a coup had given us modern schooling. So if you have a professor or a relative who said, "Did you listen to a conspiracy talk in Convocation Hall tonight?" you say, "Well, this fellow Gatto says that the president of Harvard said that in a book called The Child, the Parent, and the State." Excuse my ironic tone. Anyone interested in the details of this coup, Conant said, could read a book called Principles of Secondary Education, printed in 1918, to find out what the details were. That slight reference aroused my curiosity because I had been in a classroom about 26 years and I was ready to find out what kind of a coup had given us this instrument that I was serving. But I was frustrated because no library I went to had the book listed, not even the Columbia University Library, and that was frustrating. So I settled for looking up the author of the book instead. Now, if you keep in mind that the president of Harvard had claimed in public print that this fellow, his name was Alexander Inglis, held the key to a coup which explains modern compulsion schooling, I hope you'll be as interested in Inglis's background as I was. It seems that Inglis was the descendant of a prominent American family highly sympathetic to the British side in America's Revolution. One of his ancestors was the rector of New York City's famous Trinity Church. That's an Anglican parish representing the elite of the official state religion of Britain. And that particular Inglis was working tirelessly at the time of the Revolution to bring about a state religion in the United States. For reasons best known to himself, he fled from George Washington's advancing army. Another Inglis wrote a refutation of common sense. Now, for the young out there, you may not recognize the allusion to a book which is widely credited as being one of the fuses that led directly to the American Revolution. Paine wrote a stirring call to revolt against England, and that Inglis who wrote the refutation was paid off by being named the first Anglican bishop of Nova Scotia. If you'll be patient with me to lay in this background, when I come to tell you what Inglis says the purposes of schooling are, you'll see that you're not in the hands of a conspiracy theorist, but somebody quite important. And still another of Inglis's relatives was the commanding general of the British forces at the siege of Lucknow in India during the Sepoy uprising in 1857. He was promoted to Major General for his gallantry in the face of the rebellious Sepoy wretches. And I'll tell you one last fact about Inglis. If you ever attend the honor lecture in education at Harvard University, ever since 1926, it has been called the Inglis Lecture. And now we'll get to the 6 purposes of schooling according to Dr. Inglis. School was intended on this continent to be, as it had been in northern Germany, a 5th column into the burgeoning libertarian condition where disenfranchised and oppressed groups were clamoring for some kind of seat at the bargaining table. School was to be a surgical incision into which the class-based management theories of England were to be inserted to interdict the liberty traditions. England's multi-layered social class is simply a modern-day representation of Julius Caesar's advice that when you're overwhelmed by the enemy, you divide them and conquer them that way by setting them against each other. The method was to be by infiltration into the minds of children, out of sight of their parents. The well-read here won't be shocked. Theorists from Plato to Rousseau to Frederick of Prussia knew and taught explicitly that if children could be kept childish beyond its term in nature, if they could be cloistered in a society of children without any real responsibility except obedience, if their inner lives could be attenuated by removing the insights of history, literature, philosophy, economics, religion, if the imminence of death and the certainty of pain and loss can be removed from daily consciousness, if the profound reflections on one's own death could be replaced with the trivializing emotions of greed, envy, jealousy, and fear, young people would grow older, but they would never grow up, and a great enduring problem of supervision would be solved. For who can argue against the truth that childish and childlike people are far easier to manage than critically trained, self-reliant ones? And now you're ready to hear the 6 purposes of modern schooling taken directly from Dr. Inglis's book. The first function of schooling is adjustive. Schools are to establish fixed habits of reaction to authority. That's fixed habits of reaction. Notice that this precludes critical judgment completely. Notice, too, that requiring obedience to stupid orders is a much better test of function 1 than following sensible orders ever could be. You don't know whether people are reflexively obedient unless they'll march right off the cliff. Second is the diagnostic function. School is to determine each student's proper social role, logging the evidence mathematically and anecdotally on cumulative records. You probably thought that the kid or parents or neighbors or the region, circumstances. No, the school is to determine your proper social role, and they're to fix you in that role mathematically on their cumulative records. Next comes the sorting function. School sorts children by training individuals only so far as their likely destination in the social machine, not one step beyond. Keep in mind, you're not listening to John Gatto. You're listening to the man for whom the honor lecture in education at Harvard is named. The fourth function is conformity. As much as possible, kids are to be made alike. Whatever the background they come from, they're to be made alike. This is not done from any passion for egalitarian ideals, but so that their future behavior will be mathematically predictable in service to market research and government research. Next comes the hygienic function. This one's my favorite. This has nothing to do with individual health, but it has a lot to do with the health of the race, at least as Inglis or Darwin or his first cousin Galton saw it. Hygiene is a polite way of saying that school is expected to accelerate natural selection by tagging the unfit so clearly. That's what all those little humiliations from first grade on, that's what all the posted list of ranked grades are about, so clearly that the unfit will drop from the reproduction sweepstakes, either in despair or because their likely mates will have accepted the school's judgment of them as terminally inferior. And last comes a fancy Latin word, the propaidutic function. That's a fancy word meaning that a small fraction of lucky kids will quietly be taught how to take over management of this continuing project. Guardians of a population deliberately dumbed down and rendered childlike in order that government and economic life can be managed with a minimum of hassle. It's that low-down, nitty-gritty, common purpose. Not Marx's grand warfare between classes and greedy captains of industry. It's simply so that management will have a minimum of hassles. Now, it's one thing to say you're going to do all those things, and another to actually do them. What, for instance, would the mechanism look like which could reduce people to a state where they would be compliant in such an arrangement? While Britain and Germany had conditioned their own populations for centuries to accept paternalistic direction from the political state, it hadn't happened to anywhere near that degree in North America. And a project of this magnitude could not just be rammed down citizens' throats. They would have to be taught to actually welcome it, increment by increment. If any of you have read Orwell's 1984, it was necessary before you could get rid of Winston Smith to compel him to love Big Brother. Because if you were forced to execute him, hating Big Brother, you wouldn't know how many more Winstons were out there. So you had to adjust his mind. Now, in this system, if at any point public outrage became too loud, the scheme's managers were instructed to retract it a bit and wait until, under cover of some national emergency like war or any other civil unrest, it could be sent racing forward again while people were looking elsewhere. That is how the formidable United States ability to read and argue was deconstructed during the drums and tramplings of World War II. The plan, simplified mightily for the purposes of this talk, called for the infantilization of North America, the gradual dumbing down, the gradual demoralization, the slow, steady removal of critical responsibilities from families and their transfer to bureaucrats. What I'm talking about here is a radical extension of childhood, principally through schooling at first, but in time through every institution, including and especially popular entertainment under direction of a small elite. Popular entertainment, of course, removes the necessity to entertain oneself. But once again, we need to reiterate that childishness is not an objectionable quality to management, but rather its very justification for being. Childish people are unable to offer effective resistance to management. They may whine, complain, even shoot one another, but they have no idea how things work. So eventually they come to heel or break. Childish people, for all the noise they can make, are nearly helpless. They fall back in line because they have no other choice. They lack the inner resources to be self-sustaining. Through the second half of the 19th century, beginning in the North German states of Prussia, Saxony, and Hanover, a science of making young people childish grew up. It was studied by certain prominent Americans like Horace Mann, William Torrey Harris, the Peabody family, J.P. Morgan in Canada by Edgerton Ryerson, and by others who envied the control it offered to management and wanted that control for themselves. With the rise of the centralized corporate economy a quarter century after the Civil War, another overriding reason to place the population under tight management arose. But before I tell you about that one, which is big time, we need to get a few red herrings out of the way. At the same time this project was going, other groups besides businessmen and political leaders had reasons to advocate against intellectual education and education in personal competence. Utopian socialists like Robert Owen and John Ruskin thought that through an endless childhood, an agrarian utopia could be achieved. The evolutionary crowd like Darwin, Galton, and Herbert Spencer thought that most of us were biologically retarded and couldn't grow up, so we had to be cared for. It would only make trouble to allow people to try to grow up. Scientific historians like Hegel or Herder and Marx thought that by keeping people dumb and incomplete, history itself could finally be controlled by small elites and guided to a conclusion. There were others too, but we don't need to review them all here. I wanted you to know that there were plenty of potent interests around that wanted the public childish, but none of them had any resources. None of them had the resources of corporations to sustain a campaign in that direction. For a long time, it only required a little corporate financing done behind the scenes to allow an army of innocent academic and philosophical screwballs to do the corporate government bidding unknowingly, thinking they were riding their own hobby horses. I personally was put on the trail of radically extended childhood paid for by business by reading the works of a man named Elwood Cubberley, who was a friend of Dr. Conan at Harvard. And he was Alexander Inglis's partner at Houghton Mifflin, the publisher, where he edited the elementary school series of textbooks while Inglis managed the secondary series. Houghton Mifflin, if I pronounce that correctly, and if I don't, my apologies to the Houghton and Mifflin family, they had a monopoly on books about institutional schooling. If you wanted to read about supervision or financing or classroom technique, you bought a book from the Houghton Mifflin series for several decades, the key decades, when the institution was brand new. Cubberley was also Dean of Teacher Education at Stanford University, and while there he became head of a thing called the Education Trust, a shadowy cabal of academics nationwide who controlled every major administrative post in America by 1918. Once again, my source of this information is no conspiracy book. It's the very conservative graduate education school textbook called Managers of Virtue by David Tyack, T-Y-A-C-K, a well-respected volume that's been in print for years. All the administrative jobs in North America were under the control of a group that called itself the Education Trust until the newspapers got wind of it, and then they submarined into a new... In 1906, Cubberley had written in his PhD thesis at Columbia Teachers College that in the new schools coming, this is a direct quote, children are to be shaped and fashioned like nails, and the specifications will come from business and government in that order. If you're skeptical, and I encourage skepticism, I guess the librarian at this university can borrow Cubberley's PhD thesis fairly easily so that you can read these words for yourself. Specifications, of course, the word is a term for outcomes desired, and how those outcomes were to be reached was up to academics and bureaucrats who worked for the policy people. It's a strategy that in business is known as management by objectives. You say, I want you to be in this place at this time. I don't care how you get there. A few years later, in 1919, the same Elwood Cubberley was writing that childhood had been deliberately extended by 4 years because a combination of powerful interests had demanded this. The trick was pulled off by denying children association with the adult world and with real responsibility through comprehensive confinement schooling, which created a world of children separate from the real world. There, the little human resources could be held until summoned or not summoned. It isn't very hard to see that the interest served most directly by delaying personal sovereignty is something we can fairly call the managerial outlook. Total management and human independence are mutually contradictory terms. Once professionalized, management finds it irresistible to argue that neither children nor their parents can be trusted, that the only sensible way to handle growing up is through expert goal setting and professional interventions at public expense. What I've tried to do here in my crude way is to show you that once the institutional infrastructure is established, nobody has to know what it's about. They have to know that they don't get their paycheck unless they keep the system in a steady state. So that eventually all the architects who know what's going on could die off and the thing becomes a piece of autonomous social technology. It's time we all faced the fact that expert management is never well served by allowing children to grow up or to grow whole. Its tutelage is only justified intellectually by the academic disciplines of psychology and sociology and anthropology and evolutionary biology, even military science, each contending in its own way that growing up is impossible for most of us. All of these disciplines grew from corporate or government underwriting. Regardless of how many famous leftists are associated with these particular movements, they were all paid for by corporations or government. Why? The philosophical momentum of managerialism in the West was, in my opinion, only balked by the theology of Christianity, which expressly forbids the faithful to duck personal responsibility. and it establishes the road to salvation as a lonely personal road. You can get some assistance from being part of a congregation, but when you stand face to face with your Maker, according to this theology, there are no excuses. You are fully responsible. Thus, Western religious thinking itself became a prime target of schooling, as from a pedagogical perspective, it was implacably contrarian, so it had to be systematically destroyed. Somewhat over 100 years ago, higher academic voices in America set up a litany which communicated that however elliptical, we would remain children forever, always in need of supervision and regulation. The identical message that Prussians had heard a century and more before. One recent piece of evidence that our leaders listened to the voices came to me from a press conference held by Vice President Gore's wife just a couple days before the election of 2000. In that press conference, Tipper Gore declared that 55% of the American people are mentally disturbed and in need of therapy. But Mrs. Gore isn't the only one saying that. She's one of a host of commentators that urge daily that we be kept under closer and closer surveillance for our own good, of course. When speaking to this question of general irresponsibility, observe how convenient and useful it is if classrooms are workshops of rudeness, rowdiness, and danger. Far from being something to avoid, it's something to welcome, because how better can you instruct the onrushing generations that they can't trust one another and instruct their parents not to stand in the way of official ministration, because look how dangerous these children are. At the end of the 20th century, approximately 100,000 American school children were being barcoded in an experiment to track their passages and see to it that each boy and girl is always where someone else thinks they belong. Everything in its place, a place for everything. The profound change in the American bargain with its young, the change that dumbing them down and demoralizing them brought about, was not the result of popular demand, nor was it caused by prominent socialists like John Dewey, who are often blamed. The transformation was an undertaking, plain and simple, of industrial titans like Andrew Carnegie, J.P. Morgan, Vincent Astor, Commodore Vanderbilt, John D. Rockefeller, Henry Ford, and a few others. And if you find your skepticism rising at that statement, I suggest you ask the librarian to secure for you the 2 American congressional investigations of what's behind schooling. One was made in 1915. It's the Walsh Committee report. The other one in 1953 is a senator from Tennessee. Sorry, the name eludes me. But both of these congressional reports, which are quite extensive, came to the same conclusion, that schooling is under the direction of the private corporate foundations of this handful of men I just measured. And long after their death, that oversight continues. Just watch, if you're in the education school, how often you see a reference to one or another of the Carnegie endowments, the Ford endowments, or the Rockefeller endowments. Isn't that wonderfully generous of them? But remember, these policy people were only interested in outcomes. They left the details to underlings like Henry Kissinger or Zbigniew Brzezinski. And what is that work? One way to understand it is to see it as a systematic recreation of the class-based, expert-driven managerial society of Anglican Britain, only this time based in supposedly objective scientific principles. You know, all those bell curves that justify locking all those children away for their own good. But why would an economic leadership committed to Adam Smith's capitalistic principles veer in this decidedly socialistic direction? Fortunately, these men talk about it in their own essays, memoirs, letters, and occasional writings. Carnegie and Rockefeller, for instance, both despised competition because they thought it was irrational. As purely rational thinkers, they worked with might and main to stamp it out and to replace it with a planetary form of government which would resemble the British Empire and its Anglican corporate theology, only it would be better because more efficient. By the last quarter of the 19th century, the promise of unlimited energy, coal and oil, which really hardly had existed before then, coupled with mass production machinery, suggested that an industrial utopia was actually within reach, but only if society could be made susceptible to a degree of management beyond any historical precedent. Personal liberty and conventional morality would have to be surrendered if this promise were to be realized. Indeed, as I told you earlier, even the law of supply and demand would be forced to yield. But how to get rid of the libertarian American past? Put yourself in the position of these visionary industrialists struggling to socialize the majority into dependence on central management. If you need a crude illustration of dependence on central management, it's you raising your hand to go to the toilet. The authority of the political state had to replace the authority of family, tradition, and religion. It was a huge task. There was nowhere else to start but with the children. So drawing on the method pioneered in Prussia, the quick arrival of young Americans at responsible maturity had to be ended. Financial capital demanded this. Now, this is sort of a tricky point, so I'll try to slow down my pell-mell delivery here. Financial capital demanded this. Why would anyone make huge investments in mass production machinery that was certain to obsolete itself in a couple of years, unless the markets could be guaranteed? Unless this could be done, capital would not be forthcoming, and we would have an entirely different sort of economy than the one we have. That sounds like a titanic task, but assuring markets is an old game. Britain had been doing it for centuries. Competition can be muted a lot of ways, through trust formation, through government regulation, through government subsidies that stack the market deck, and in many ways unknown to the butcher, the baker, or the candlestick maker. But not so easy was convincing our uniquely productive population to give up its traditional yearning for independent livelihoods. The majority had to be retrained to think of itself as employees and as consumers instead of producers. A job is what someone else gives you. Otherwise, the perils of overproduction would frighten away the investment that centralized industrial growth depends upon. And so, mass schooling of a compulsory nature was given its teeth between 1905 and 1915. I believe a little bit earlier than that in Canada, because Canada was often used as the testing ground for these ideas. We'd see how much resistance, I believe it's Bruce Cooper's The Making of the Educational State, written by a Canadian about the Canadian experience, that will tell you how vigorously Canadians resisted this, and how the Army was called out frequently to shove it down their throats. I guess that's much different than the usual story you hear that a grateful populace welcomed these people, maybe like the Americans marching into Paris after World War II. I don't think that happened. And so mass schooling of a compulsory nature was given its teeth. No longer was it charged with fashioning good people or good citizens. Now it was directed, exactly as it had been in northern Germany, to the inculcation of habits, fears, appetites, and attitudes useful to management. That's all you need to know to understand what standardized testing is. That is all you need to know. It measures nothing else. Keep in mind that this scheme was never intended to be destructive, just the reverse. By converting Americans into specialized economic and social functions, into incompletely human beings, this nation, the United States, but Canada also, eventually achieved the most reliable domestic market in the world. The human mutilations of schooling are a trade-off for this prosperity. Comfort and security are achieved at the price of personal sovereignty. That's what makes extended childhood a paradox. Give it up, and the society would enter a zone of great turbulence, the resolution of which nobody can predict. Once you see its logic, the mechanisms of forced schooling are fairly simple to avoid. And now, in my strange Pittsburgh manner, I'll get to something positive here, because by knowing and seeing clearly this negative foundation, you can in fact contradict it point by point. Once you see the logic, it's fairly simple to avoid. Well-schooled people are trained to reflexively obey strangers' commands and to continually seek the judgment of strangers. That's how A's are distributed. Later on, after the school game is over, advertising and advocacy journalism, paid for by advertisers, slips easily into the role of school teacher. Well-schooled people have a low threshold of boredom. They need constant novelty to feel alive. With only the flimsiest inner life, they must stay in touch with official voices through television, radio, internet, cell phone, commercial music, and other commercial entertainments, pop journalism, and shallow friendships exchanged on a regular basis. One thing I would always tell young people would ask me, how do you avoid marrying some turkey? I said, well, one of the things you can do is find out who the person's friends are. And this is hardly very profound advice. And if all their friends are new and yet they're 25 years old, you might wonder how they've passed through all the earlier phases of friends and not carried any of them with you. Changing classes at short intervals is a drill to prepare kids for changing associates, domiciles, mates, and possessions in dizzying and eternal profusion. A climate of low-level dissatisfaction is the very air that a mass production economy must breathe. I mean, God forbid that any of you would fall in love with a pair of shoes like my father did and wear them for 25 years. You're meant to be bored instantly with what you buy, or very shortly afterward, or terrified into thinking that that computer that you struggled for a year to set up on your desk is now hopelessly out of date and will do more harm for you. So hurry and work more and buy another one which will be replaced reliably in the next 6 months to a year. Well-schooled people must be poorly trained in history, philosophy, economics, literature, poetry, music, art, theology, in anything known through history to develop a personal inner life. Well-schooled people need lifelong tutelage, cradle-to-grave schooling to make any sense of their days. Mass entertainment and mass journalism provide that tutelage long after school is done. Over a century ago, great industrialists, with the help of academics and politicians, set out to rewrite the laws of supply and demand. They knew that if centralized producers learned to create demand for whatever could be produced most efficiently, the moral world could be turned upside down, and those dogs at the top could bark there forever. The problem of succession, which doomed Rome and every other empire in human history to date, would finally have found its solution. Thus, schoolrooms became laboratories of experimentation on young minds, research centers of scientific management. To be quit of this school nightmare demands first that we wake up to what our schools have evolved into. They are servants of corporate business and big government management. If you seek a change in schooling, you're going to first have to repudiate that fatal belief you have that if only government could be given more control, or only business, then all would sort itself out. In the United States, Mr. Nader was right. Both political parties work to exactly the same ends. There will be no relief from that quarter, from leapfrogging political parties. Another repudiation you're going to have to make is that you must begin to regard modern North America as neither a democracy or a republic. It is clearly an empire careening out of control, bent on projecting its own domestic controls to the entire planet. Now, what to do about this personally? Learn to be a saboteur of this thing. Throw sand in the gears of the machine wherever you can. There is no way to reform it. It does exactly what it was designed to do. Recognize the paradox of extended childhood, the blessings that it brings to managers while it curses your children, the prosperity it invests the economy with by converting spirits destined for independence into whining, greedy, bored children who define themselves by what they consume. That prize is too contemptible to be worth the cost when you next find yourself appalled by the infantile and irresponsible behavior you see all around you. Think of school as its forge and try to do something personally about it. Now, if you'd like to follow these arguments further, I have a 310,000-word book out at the book table. It's prior to the actual publication, so not many people have seen it yet. And it's although it's priced in American dollars, if any of you would like to own it, you can have it for the Canadian dollar equivalent. So it says $30 American, but it's $30 Canadian for today only. Don't tell anyone else I said that. Also, if you'd like to know what other projects I'm working on with some other people, go to my website, johntaylorgatto.com, and we'll be glad to hear from you. Thank you. God bless. Thank you very much.